info. She is talking about ghosts hanging around what some say is a real-life haunted house in Metro Detroit.
Haunted houses pop up all over the place this time of year.
A new Wall Street Journal report profiles the many parents who think they can see ghosts, specters, and mysterious movements on their advanced baby monitors.
Baby crib.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
You are tuned in to the Ghost Signal.
Hello, dear listeners, spooks and specters, and welcome to the Ghost Signal. My name is Jeff, and I will be your control operator for this episode, your candy man behind a swarm of bees, your annoying brother saying they're coming to get you, Barbara, when you just want to visit a cemetery in peace. The thing that's there when the lights are off then disappears after you turn them back on. If this is your first time finding the Ghost Signal, glad to have you along, dear listener. If you are coming back for more, welcome back. This is episode 17, You Are Mine to Kill. Also included is a little piece of spooky news for you ghost hunters out there. If you like what you hear, please consider visiting theghostsignalpodcast.com, where you will find links to email me haunting tales of your own, to browse merchandise, to the Ghost Signal Patreon, and the path to the Discord server where you can interact with me and others directly. First, a bit of news. This is a brand new segment called Creepin' It Real, where I bring you weird news stories from across the great wide internet, stories that by their very nature fly under the radar of conventional news outlets. Here's the segue, some spooky little thing I threw together. Like to hit, go.
Here's a question. Have you seen a ghost? Reports of ghost sightings and paranormal activity are on the rise this year.
It's a trend across Raleigh and the country. New at 11, CBS 17's Bridget Chapman getting answers about what it could be.
Experts say reports of paranormal activity are spiking this year. Claims of unusual noises, movements, and feelings. NOS says their emails about activity in people's homes shot up 50% in March.
A supposedly haunted mental hospital opened in 1902 in central Illinois has reopened to the public for paranormal investigations. Peoria State Hospital, originally named the Illinois Asylum for the Incurable Insane, will start welcoming the public back for tours on Saturday from 7 to 10. Paranormal investigations will also be available on August 20th. The guided tours include 3 Peoria State Hospital buildings, the Monument area, 4 cemeteries, and the Old State Mine Haunted Trail, according to the museum. Tickets are $50 per person and available on www.tickettailor.com. As of July 12th, the Peoria State Hospital Museum started offering private tours of the asylum. On those walkthroughs, guides take guests to paranormal hotspots inside the building, and the team is then left alone to explore the property for the remainder of the tour. Dr. George Zeller, an area surgeon, was known as the father of the institution and believed in a new kind of institution back in the 20th century where people with mental illness could be treated humanely, according to the museum. Zeller notably took off all the bars on the windows, removed all forms of restraint, and began a new holistic approach to therapy, which made others consider him mad. Peoria State Hospital was considered number 1 for curing patients for 69 out of its 71 operating years, the museum noted, as well as number 1 for its nursing program for 30 of its 31 active years. In 1973, the hospital closed due to a lack of funding and staffing, according to the website, though employees protested the termination. When the hospital closed its doors, 63 buildings stood on the grounds. But because of a taboo surrounding the property, most were torn down, with 12 left standing. Though doctors and nurses stopped treating patients in the 1970s, visitors continued to return to the grounds after paranormal activity was reported. According to Illinois Haunted Houses, the property could be haunted by Manuel A. Bookbinder, who was reportedly a patient at the hospital who worked with the burial crew. At the time of Bookbinder's funeral, Zeller allegedly said 400 staff and patients saw his ghost. The website said they even opened the coffin to confirm his body was still inside, which it was. If you're listening to this and are planning to go or have already gone, please email me about it. I would love to tell your story, and I'm sure others would love to hear it. A bit of a disclaimer before we begin. I would love nothing more to continue the story of the Haskins family. This is a classic tale of looking before you leap, folks. I did not properly vet this story before I decided to tell it to you, dear listener. For whatever reason, I was under the assumption that this was based on a true story, but it is not. It is complete fiction, and the author might be a bit peeved if I give a detailed telling of the second half as I did the first if he ever finds out. So consider episode 15 a really long teaser for the book, which is a fantastic read, by the way. If you like that episode and want to find out what happens next, please consider purchasing the book on Amazon or wherever you like to get your spooky stories from. My deepest apologies not only to the author, but to you as well, dear listener. In August of 1878, in a small town by the name of Amherst in Nova Scotia, Canada, a great mystery was unfolding. It remains controversial and unsolved to this day, but believers vehemently stand by claims that a poltergeist tormented Esther Cox for about a year and a half, and that everything that happened to her in those 18 months were the direct result of a prolonged spiritual attack. Prepare for dead air.
Dead air.
The time, the night of September 10th, 1878. The place, a bedroom in shoemaker Daniel Teed's two-story cottage at 6 Princess Street, Amherst, Nova Scotia. The message, Esther Cox, you are mine to kill. The family watched in horrible fascination as the foot-high letters appeared on the plaster wall above the girl's bed, words not written by human hands. Esther screamed. Her sister, Olive Teed, hugged her close. Several onlookers struggled to understand the meaning of the chilling phrase. No one slept that September night. In the morning, the bleary-eyed Daniel Teed staggered off to his foreman's job at the Amherst shoe factory. He could not foresee that forces unknown and unknowable would wreak havoc upon his home for the next 18 months. Daniel's household was a large one. He and his wife, Olive, were parents of 2 small boys, Willie, aged 5, and George, aged 1. Also living under his roof were Olive's 2 unmarried sisters, Esther Cox, aged 18, and Jenny Cox, aged 22, and their brother William. Daniel's brother, John Teed, boarded at the house and worked in the shoe factory. With 8 people and only 4 upstairs bedrooms, the house was obviously crowded. But Daniel seldom complained. He had been glad to offer a home to his wife's siblings after their mother's death and their father's remarriage and subsequent move to the United States. Esther and Jenny shared 1 bedroom. They could not have been more different in appearance and in personality. Esther was short and heavyset with a pale moon-shaped face and a child's naivete in at least some aspects of life. However, she had a moody disposition when she didn't get her way. Jenny, however, was slender with dark cascading locks, flashing eyes, and the ability to get whatever she wanted. She could have any suitor in Amherst, but spurned them all. The first clue of strange happenings in the Teed home actually began about a week before the grim words appeared on Esther's wall. On the cold, rainy night of September 4th, 1878, Esther awoke her sister. "There's something in bed with us," she cried. Jenny leaped out of her bed and turned up the oil lamp. Something did seem to be moving inside the mattress, making faint scratching noises, but after several minutes of quiet, The girls shook out the bedclothes and punched the mattress, but neither saw or felt any lumps. Jenny said Esther was probably dreaming. They went back to bed and slept fitfully until dawn. The next night it was Jenny's turn to be frightened. She heard a rustling coming from beneath their bed. The girls had a carton of quilt pieces stored under there. Maybe a mouse had somehow gotten inside of it. Jenny reached under the bed and pulled the box into the middle of the room. Seconds later, it suddenly rose several inches into the air and then tipped over. Jenny stood it back up, but it flipped over again, and then the girls screamed in unison. Daniel Teed came rushing in, hitching up his trousers as they stumbled through the door. He laughed when Jenny stammered out the tale. He said they both must have been imagining things. He pushed the cavorting carton back under the bed and slammed the door behind him on his way out. Jenny didn't touch the box again. She lay quietly, not sleeping the rest of the night. On the third night, Esther awoke gasping, "I'm dying. Please help me." Jenny quickly lit the lamp. Her sister's face was blood red, her eyes bulged, and her short hair stood on end. Esther's arms and legs began to swell, and she cried out in pain. At the same moment, something began banging on the walls. Olive and Daniel awakened at the racket and rushed into the girls' bedroom. Jenny stood trembling in her corner, her hands covering her face. A terrible blow against the outside wall shook the room. Esther's body seemed to deflate as if air were slowly being released from a balloon. The incident was not discussed at breakfast the following morning. Could it be that for some reason Esther could not recall the events? No one knew, and no one asked. On the following night, the heavy bed quilts rose from the girls' bed and landed in a corner of the room. Jenny retrieved them, and as she started back to bed, she noticed her sister's body starting to swell again. Crashing blows shook the walls, and Esther's body shrank back to its normal size. Daniel Teed had seen and heard enough. He summoned a local physician, Dr. Thomas W. Cartwright. The entire family gathered around as Dr. Cartwright examined the besieged teenager. He shook his head. A diagnosis is going to be difficult, he thought. She might have some sort of a nervous problem. As he sat by her bedside, the girl's pillow rose up from beneath her head and inflated itself like a balloon. Flying through the air, the pillow smacked John Teed in the face. Dr. Cartwright hurried to his office and returned with a potent sedative. Esther gratefully took it and fell into a deep sleep, but now a steady hammering was coming from the roof, as if someone were putting down shingles with a sledgehammer. Family members could find no cause for it. Meanwhile, Dr. Cartwright, alone in Esther's room, claimed he was hit on the head by a bushel of potatoes that Jenny had been peeling earlier in the evening. The blows sent him sprawling across the floor. Daniel Teed had sworn his extended family and Dr. Cartwright to secrecy about these incidents. However, townspeople soon learned what was going on. Passers-by couldn't help but hear the weird sounds emanating daily from the house. Persons of insatiable curiosity trampled Teed's front lawn and his flower beds to get close enough to peer through the windows. Daniel was forced to ask for police protection. Dr. Cartwright returned to the Teed house every day for 3 weeks, keeping his patient in a semi-comatose state to ease her suffering. And it was in this state that Esther first muttered a fragmented and terrifying tale to relatives gathered at her bedside. This was her story. Although the weather had been unsettled with a storm rising on the western horizon, she had agreed to go buggy riding one night the previous summer with Bob McNeil, an employee at the shoe factory. He had tried to seduce her, but when she refused his sexual advances, he pulled a pistol from his coat pocket, cocked the hammer, and took aim at her. Lightning slashed the sky, thunder roared, and rain pelted the buggy. Instead of pulling the trigger, the angry young man whipped the horses, heading deep into the woods. Esther feared that McNeil was going to make good on his threat by killing her and dumping her body in the forest. But he didn't get the chance. Just then, she heard a wagon coming up behind them, its wooden wheels creaking over the rough terrain. McNeil sharply swung the buggy around and, at breakneck speed, headed back to Amherst. He delivered Esther to her door and was never seen again in the village. Esther hadn't told anyone of her frightful night. Esther's ramblings finally stopped. She turned her head toward the wall and again lapsed into a deep sleep. Daniel put one arm around his wife and the other around Jenny, who wept softly. As McNeil's boss at the shoe factory, Daniel had been puzzled as anyone about the young man's sudden disappearance. He had known nothing, of course, about McNeil's date with Esther. The only thing Daniel had learned was what other villagers knew, that McNeil had paid up his rent to his landlady and vanished. Eventually he had been forgotten, but now the questions came back. Where had Bob McNeil gone? Had he been killed? Could his vengeful ghost have returned to punish Esther Cox for not giving in to him? When her sister stirred again, Jenny asked if she recalled telling the story of the attempted rape. Esther looked away and nodded. Was it true? Jenny wanted to know. It is true, whispered Esther, tears welling up in her eyes. Then it must be Bob McNeil who was responsible for this awful spirit, Jenny continued. In quick succession, 3 loud taps sounded from the bedroom wall. The small group stared in fascination. I think it understands what we're saying, Jenny whispered. Tap, 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 came the reply. Over the next several minutes, Dr. Cartwright worked out a code with Esther's unseen tormentor. 1 tap meant no, 2 taps signified a maybe, and 3 taps a definite yes. It is claimed that the spirit was able to answer such simple questions as the number of people in the room and the time of day or night. Despite his newfound ability to communicate with the supposed spirit, Dr. Cartwright had exhausted his knowledge of conventional remedies for Esther's and the family's problems. Religion might provide a cure. A prominent Baptist minister, the Reverend Dr. Edwin Clay, was asked to visit the house. He agreed with Dr. Cartwright that Esther was not producing the noises herself, and after several visits he posed an intriguing theory. Since electricity had just come into wide usage, he wondered if the young woman had received an electric shock and had been turned into a kind of living battery. The noises that shook the house might be small claps of thunder coming in from Esther's body. She said once that she felt electricity coursing through her. This fantastic hypothesis brought lots of attention, especially to the Reverend Dr. Clay, who spoke of it from the pulpit. The Teed's own minister, the Reverend A. Temple of the Methodist Church, also came calling to see if he could lend any theological insight into the troubles. He sat in the kitchen visiting with the family, and a cold bucket of water on the table started to boil. The minister excused himself and backed out the door and did not ever return. Meanwhile, lack of sleep and frayed nerves were telling on Daniel Teed. He was tired of the visitors, peeved with the sightseers in his yard, and frustrated with his strange sister-in-law, whom some people were now calling a faker. But a solution suddenly seemed to present itself in the most unexpected way. Esther contracted diphtheria, and the dreaded disease kept everyone away except Dr. Cartwright. Curiously, and to the surprise and relief of the family, all phenomena ceased during the 2 weeks that Esther was ill. Daniel sent Esther away to convalesce at the home of another of her married sisters, a Mrs. Snowden in Sackville, New Brunswick. No phenomena occurred at the Sackville house. Peace continued to reign in Amherst, and Daniel Teed was happier than he'd been in months. But Jenny and Olive wanted their sister back home, and Esther was eager to return. Daniel consented. The phenomena were gone. Daniel even shuffled the bedrooms around to provide a new room for Esther and Jenny. He wanted Esther to make a fresh start. That start was more frightening than anyone could have ever imagined. On the first night of Esther's return, small fireballs fell from the ceiling of her bedroom. One of Esther's dresses hanging from a peg on the wall was set afire. Daniel was in the room when this happened and snuffed out the fire just in time. In the coming days, Olive's dresses were torched and small spontaneous fires were discovered nearly every day in various parts of the house. One afternoon, a bucket of cedar shavings in the basement started to burn. Esther ran across the street, screaming for help. The fire department arrived, and although no charges were ever filed, many of the firemen suspected arson, perhaps by Esther. Olive knew better. She and her sister had been together, alone in the house. There had been no opportunity for Esther to have sneaked down into the basement. That night, Jenny asked the spirit if it intended to burn the house down. Tap, tap, tap. Now, adult members of the family slept in shifts to keep constant watch for the flames that might destroy the house and all sleeping occupants in it. Within a week, Daniel Teed ordered Esther out of his house. He was sorry, he said, but her presence posed too great a danger to the rest of the family members. This time, Olive and Jenny could not save their sister despite their pleading. Esther had to leave. She might have walked the streets had it not been for the generosity of one John W. White, a local restaurateur. He offered the penniless, frightened girl employment and lodging with his own family. White didn't believe any of the tales he'd heard and read about in the Teed house. Besides, he had always been a champion of the underdog. His own life had been a struggle, and he was always willing to help a young person. Esther would have a new chance, as he put it, at his restaurant. White's generosity almost ruined him. Whenever Esther served customers, knives, forks, and spoons flew off tables and counters and clung to the girl's clothing. Doors opened and closed by themselves, and the door to a large oven fell off its stout hinges. Heavy tables and chairs moved around the dining room whenever the girl was on duty, frightening customers who vowed never to come back. With regret, White realized that he could not keep Esther in his employ. He sent her back home to 6 Princess Street. Daniel did not have to take her back as it happened. He just received a communication from a stranger, one Captain James Beck of St. John, New Brunswick. The captain wrote that he'd been following the press accounts of Esther and was intrigued by the story. He said he'd like the opportunity for several of his physicians to study the girl. For 3 weeks, Esther was a guest in the Captain and Mrs. Beck's home, and for 21 days nothing happened. She did, however, entertain her hosts and their guests with stories of the ghosts that were threatening her. She identified them by name: Peter Cox, Maggie Fisher, and Bob Nickel. The last one, a thinly veiled reference to Bob McNeil, threatened her with fires and stabbings, she said. Maggie Fisher was the name of an old school friend, long deceased. She didn't know who Peter Cox was, but he was probably an ancestor. In time, the Beck sent her back to Amherst, and again Daniel Teed turned her away. Fortunately, another couple in the region, the Van Ambergs, were willing to provide her with room and board. Mr. Van Amberg farmed, and his wife was a sturdy, patient, hardworking woman who quickly developed an attachment to Esther. Esther had never imagined such peace. She slept soundly every night and awoke refreshed each morning, anxious to help Miss Van Amberg with the necessary chores. But such good fortune did not last. Olive Teed wanted her sister back home and had persuaded her husband to give Esther yet another chance. But that chance was ill-advised. Esther had no sooner stepped over the threshold of the Teed's house than the poltergeist began its mischief. Walls shook with heavy vibrations, while above their heads the roof reverberated as if it were being bombarded with hundreds of heavy bricks. Daniel was prepared this time. He shipped Esther off immediately to Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Davidson, a rural couple who wanted a servant girl in their home. Within days of her arrival, the Davidsons' barn was destroyed by fire. Esther was accused of arson, arrested, indicted, and convicted. She spent a month in jail, but only through the efforts of sympathetic friends in Amherst was she released. Daniel was at his wits' end, compounding the real fear that the Teeds had that their house and their lives might be destroyed by whatever haunted Esther Cox were the cries from the various Amherst clergy that Satan had insinuated himself in their midst in the body of young Esther. There were calls from some quarters demanding that the entire family be driven from the village. Stepping into this cauldron of fear and suspicion was one Walter Hubble, a skeptical American magician who believed that he had the answer to the possession of Esther Cox. He would lay the ghost, a 19th century term for exorcising a spirit from the household. He told the Teeds that he would pay for his own food and lodging if he could visit the home and decide for himself if the young woman was indeed possessed or a fraud. The Teeds had little choice. Either they permanently banned Esther from the only home she ever really had, or if she stayed, they faced the wrath of their superstitious neighbors. And Hubble's talents were well known. Indeed, he had performed all across Canada. Perhaps, Daniel prayed, the magician could succeed where others had failed. If there was any thought that the appearance of the famous magician would silence the ghost, Hubble's first visit proved the opposite. On the rainy morning he walked through the front door, the umbrella he held was wrenched out of his hands, and a butcher knife hurtled through the air directly at him. He quickly ducked as the terrible missile embedded itself in the wall behind him. It had been thrown with such force, by whom or by what no one knew, that the handle vibrated for several seconds. No sooner had Hubble recovered from his shocking introduction to the poltergeist than all the chairs in the dining room rocked backward and crashed to the floor. After a few hours of quiet, Hubble and the family sat down to their noonday meal. Quick raps came from the table. The magician said he knew the code and would carry on a conversation with the spirits. For several minutes, Hubble rapped out a series of messages that appeared to be answered by the spirits. He told the mystified family that the spirits had told him the correct dates of the coins in his pockets, and he produced the coins as evidence. The slick maneuverings of a professional magician, or evidence of spirit world communication? The question lingers. During Hubble's 5-week stay, he was an eyewitness to various sorts of flying missiles, but the self-styled debunker of ghostly phenomena couldn't explain the bizarre events he witnessed, including at breakfast one morning, a china sugar bowl vanished from the table, and 10 minutes later, it was falling from the ceiling. A blooming plant and a can filled with water apparently rising up from the kitchen floor and settling down on the floor of the parlor. No one had been in the kitchen at the time. A small German silver trumpet materializing out of nowhere and treating the family to blaring quote-unquote music day and night. It was said that no one in Amherst owned such an instrument. Toward the end of Hubble's investigation, he approached Esther and the family with an idea. He suggested putting Esther on stage in a vampire costume and letting her summon the ghosts. She'd be a sensation in North America and the European capitals, he said. And Hubble, of course, would be her business manager. Olive was violently opposed. The idea of her sister being displayed as some sort of freak was out of the question. "Don't be silly," Daniel shot back. "We need the income this would bring." He grimly pointed out that William Cox and John Teed had already left the house in disgust, and they were nearly bankrupt. Broken furniture littered the rooms, china had been smashed, the wallpaper was charred from the mysterious fires, and valuable silver had vanished. Olive continued to protest, but to no avail. Daniel agreed with Hubble that Esther should be put on the stage and that she should appear for the first time in Amherst. Hubble was by this point thoroughly convinced that some supernatural force inhabited Esther's body and compared her gifts to those of the finest spiritualist mediums. He rented a public hall and spared no money to advertise the big event. What Esther's position was on all the decisions being made for her is not recorded. If she did not wholeheartedly endorse the project, she at least went along with the magician's scheme. At her debut in Amherst, Esther Cox faced a hall jammed with curious spectators. She appeared in her absurd vampire costume, but the spirits were taking the night off. No supernatural manifestations occurred. Angry patrons demanded their money back. The evening was a humiliating experience for Esther and a great disappointment to Hubble. However, the magician was not easily discouraged. There were places all over Canada where Esther, the girl with the devils in her, as Hubble billed her, could perform. On June 18, 1879, in a Moncton, New Brunswick auditorium, various household objects placed on the stage flew about when Esther appeared. Reports of the event claimed spectators were unable to see any evidence of trickery or fraud. Now certain of success, Hubble booked Esther for a performance at the Moncton Baptist Church. There, loud rappings came from the church floor. The faithful were impressed enough to drive both Esther and Hubble from the church. Their act didn't receive any better reviews in Chatham, New Brunswick. The pair were chased out of town by stone-throwing citizens. Clearly, Esther's talents were not to be tolerated at all, and the girl with devils in her canceled all of her remaining performances in fear for her life. Walter Hubble performed one final peculiar deed, however, before vanishing from Amherst and Esther's life forever. He summoned a Micmac Indian medicine man from Pictou, Nova Scotia, to drive the devils out of Esther Cox. The young woman agreed, though the rituals seemed weird and frightening. The unnamed Indian succeeded where preachers and physicians had failed. He freed the spirits that had plagued her for so long. Esther eventually married a man from Springdale, Nova Scotia, but the marriage was not a happy one. After her husband died, Esther moved to the United States, where she married Peter Shanahan, a workman at the J.M. O'Donnell Shoe Factory in Brockton, Massachusetts, where she bore him one son. He and his father were at Esther's bedside when she died at the age of 52. Meanwhile, Walter Hubble wrote a book called The Great Amherst Mystery that would become a bestseller in both Canada and the United States. The book had gone through 10 printings by 1916, as Hubble dredged up increasing amounts of material from the copious notes he took of the events in which he had been so intimately involved. Olive Teed said that Hubble sensationalized some incidents, but that it was a basically honest portrayal of her sister's long and agonizing illness. The case of Esther Cox was never solved, but a modern psychotherapist could posit some explanations. Even though the young girl outwardly rebuked the darkly handsome Bob McNeil for suggesting a romp in the woods, part of her certainly craved that intimacy. Esther was not conventionally attractive and realized that suitors were not to be found with any degree of regularity in the isolated environs of Amherst, Nova Scotia. In turning McNeil aside, she may have unconsciously projected upon herself the torments that she suffered. Experts theorize that sexual frustration and confusion can initiate poltergeist activity. There is also a question about the role that Daniel played in Esther's suffering. Although he never inflicted physical pain upon her, as far as we know, he verbally abused her and mistreated her badly by throwing her out of the house repeatedly. Again, Esther may have unconsciously sought to be severely punished and degraded by her brother-in-law. All theories aside, the case of Esther Cox remains a classic account of poltergeist hauntings, and is certainly one of Canada's best-known ghost stories. The house at 6 Princess Street is long gone, but the memory of the girl with devils in her remains. Ghost tours, books, and even independent films and plays celebrate the history of Esther Cox. Whether or not any part of the story is true is unimportant. The legend of the Great Amherst Mystery is one of the greatest ghost stories ever told, and will continue to spook and scare for generations to come. And that's it for episode 17. If you've made it all the way to the end, you have my sincerest gratitude, dear listener. With the paranormal podcast market as oversaturated as it is, it's difficult to get noticed. But if you like what you hear, please spread the word. Visit the website, theghostsignalpodcast.com, to drop me a line, get into the Discord server, or check out the Ghost Signal Patreon. The Ghost Signal is executively produced by Jason Wilson, Patreon by Brooks Bigley, creative direction by Cassie, custom sound beds by J.M. Scherf, video editing by Hale, and I'm your ghost host with the most, Control Operator Jeff. Next time on the Ghost Signal is the tale of the demon of Larrabee Street. Until then, dear listeners, ending transmission. Reach me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Grey Rooms production. Copyright 2021 and 2022.
The ghost signal is lost. Transmission terminated.